Good evening and welcome to our Fourscore Speaker Series. Tonight, we are thrilled to have Dr. Yael Sternhell with us to discuss her latest book, War on Record, The Archive and the Afterlife of the Civil War. My name is Phyllis Evans, and I am the Senior Director of Development at the Lincoln Presidential Foundation. Our foundation's purpose is to support, sustain, and provide educational and public programming, research, and access to historic places and collections related to the life and legacy of Abraham Lincoln in cooperation with other entities. Our vision is the global protection and expansion of freedom and democracy inspired by the life and work of President Abraham Lincoln. For more information on how you can support this mission, please visit our website at lincolnpresidential.org. Before we begin tonight's program, I just want to remind you that we will entertain questions from the audience, so please type them in the Q&A box below and we'll get to as many as we possibly can. And now, please join me in welcoming our Foundation President and CEO, Erin Carlson-Mast. Erin?
Thank you, Phyllis. Greetings, everyone, and thank you for being with us for another Fourscore Speaker Series. We're delighted to be joined today by Dr. Yael Sternhell to discuss her newest book, War on Record, The Archive and the Afterlife of the Civil War. The Civil War generated a vast archive of official records, documents that would shape the post-war era and determine what future generations would know about the war. In this book, Dr. Sternhell traces these records from their creation during wartime through their deployment in a host of post-war battles, including those between the federal government and Southerners making claims for reparations, and between veterans blaming each other for defeat. She recounts how these documents were eventually published in arguably the most consequential historical collection ever to have been assembled in the United States, The War of the Rebellion, the official records of the Union and Confederate Armies. Known as the OR for short, for obvious reasons, it has been the ultimate source for generations of scholars and writers and ordinary citizens researching the war. By delving into this archive and the creation of the OR, Sternhell reveals its power to shape myths, hide truths, perpetuate rancor, and foster reconciliation between some Americans. She argues that more than a storehouse of papers, the Civil War archive is a major historical actor in its own right. Dr. Sternhell is an associate professor of history and American studies at Tel Aviv University, specializing in the history of the long Civil War era, the global history of archives, and the history of modern societies at war. She's also published the book, Roots of War, The World of Movement in the Confederate South, and her work has won awards from the Organization of American Historians, the Southern Historical Association, and the Society for Civil War Historians. Beyond academia, Sternhell is a board member of the New Israel Fund, Israel's leading human rights organization, and a regular contributor for Haaretz. Also, for those of you doing the quick mental calculations for the time difference, Dr. Sternhell is stateside this year as the Joseph Engel Visiting Associate Professor of Jewish Studies at Harvard University. Yael, welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Our audience always appreciates knowing a little bit about the author's personal journey. Can you tell us about yourself and what led you to the history profession?
Okay, so I was born to a family of academics. My father was kind of a renowned historian of European fascism and also a Holocaust survivor. So history and the meaning of history was always there. Like I don't remember a time in my life when I was not deeply concerned with questions about the human past, and specifically with the question of the outbreak of war, how societies function in wartime, what happens to individuals in wartime, what happens to families. All of these things have basically been with me my whole life. And because I was the child of an academic, we also traveled quite a bit and spent years every once in a while in the United States, where I went to public school and kind of bought into what public schools tell you, which is that US history is the most important and most interesting subject anyone could learn. And that kind of stayed with me. And so I was an undergraduate student at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, where I was born and raised. And then when it came time to choose a path, it was clear to me that I wanted to move to the US for a long stretch of time, that I wanted to continue my studies here. And on some level, I knew that I was going to stick with US history and that I was going to stick with the Civil War era, because I think on some, this is sort of my own analysis of my psychology. I think in a way, the Civil War for me is a form of processing my own family's history in World War II, but in a way that is sort of safer, is a little bit further removed, and kind of doesn't force me into confronting, the kind of the personal pain that comes with that kind of history. So I think that sort of explains how I ended up as a Civil War historian, coming from where I do. And I really do still think that the Civil War is just incredible lab of human behavior that continues to fascinate us, because it really forces us to ask the deepest question about humankind and about humankind in war, in a time of war.
I absolutely agree with that. And I think it just those big ideas and humanitarian themes tend to, echo throughout time. And, I found that while I was not originally interested in Civil War history in undergrad, it is, and, everything else I did was sort of surrounding it, but not in it. And yet it is one of those not only endlessly fascinating things, but something that is referenced all the time in
Right.
contemporary life and society. So understanding it seems to be of the utmost importance. So
Right. And I
you,
think the basic questions are still with us, right?
yeah,
I mean, in some ways, they haven't really changed.
yeah. So you undoubtedly encountered the OR during your studies, during your research, as you started out your career. How did your use of the OR
And
influence your decision to create War on Record? What prompted you to write this book?
okay, so I'll say two things. I became a sucker of the OR very early on. It was actually as an undergraduate student in the late 1990s in Jerusalem. And I think this is not, it's more than a personal anecdote. I think that the accessibility of the OR and the searchability of it, it was one of the first bodies of knowledge to become available online. I still used it on a CD-ROM, which was also available in the 1990s and shippable to Israel. I think Amazon was already in business. I think that's how I was able to procure a copy. But then it went fully online. And the thing with the OR is that when you start reading it, you almost can't resist it. And this is the kind of conversation that I'm now having with, everyone in my field, is how do we kind of get past that infatuation with the OR? Because it really is time travel. It kind of throws you back. The prose is, I mean, I say this also in the book, some of these men actually write like they want to be quoted. And I think they do want to be quoted. And I think they know that they're going to be quoted. And so I was a sucker of the OR. I've used it, for my first book. I've used it for whatever I published, had an OR element. But I didn't start this project because I wanted to investigate the OR. I started this project because I had kind of a nagging question that stayed with me in the aftermath of my first book. When I was writing that book, which is about basically the experience of mobility in the Civil War South, I was basically arguing that in that book that the most salient experience of human beings during the Civil War was not violence, but movement, and that everyone experienced movement in some way or another, either as spectators or as refugees, stragglers, soldiers on the move, enslaved people running away, you name it. The movement of the physical body was key. And I noticed while working on this project that every time a Confederate government fled town, and Confederate governments fled town more than you would think, right? It's not just Richmond, it's bigger than that. State governments fled, the national government prepared to flee more times than it actually did. They took two things with them on the train. They took the gold and they took the archive.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of got me thinking about, like, what the was in that archive? Like, why did it matter to them? Was it only an administrative issue? Or were they also looking to preserve a written record of their cause that then got handed down to us? So I found, there wasn't really anything about this. And I found a couple of articles really old ones from the 1930s and 40s by someone who would then become a kind of a major figure in my book. I mean, maybe not major is overstating it, but someone I'd become really interested in, Dallas Irvine, who was a 20th century archivist, one of the first professional employees of the National Archive, and someone who was very central at the National Archives from its founding in 1934, like into the 1970s. And he had written some articles about what happened to Confederate records. How were they brought? How are they managed once they became owned by the federal government? And I went to the archive in DC and showed one of the archivists a footnote. And she said one sentence to me. She said, she knew where to find it. I didn't understand what the reference was. It was like a very technical National Archives citation. And she looked at it and she said, kind of very offhand, you may want to look at other records in that collection. And that's what I did. So they started bringing out the boxes, and anyone here who's done historical research knows what it's like when you're in the archive, right? And the boxes start coming up. And this is an archival point that I think is really interesting. Because the papers of the agency that ended up archiving Confederate records, because they were cataloged not by year, but alphabetically, as soon as I started going through these pieces of paper, and again, I had no idea what's in there. I saw records from 1865, and then I saw records from 1877. And it became immediately clear to me that the records were really, really different between time periods, that these bureaucrats managing Confederate records were speaking about the Confederacy in one way in 1865 and then speaking about it in a different way in 1877. I found very early on, like my first day, the correspondence with the Southern Historical Society.
Oh, wow.
It's so friendly. It's so affectionate. And I'm like, what? I mean, where is this coming from? And that's how I got started. And over time, I realized that this is not actually a project about the Confederate records, that it's a project about what the federal government does with its Civil War records and how those actions shape two things: shape the politics of the post-war era and shape what we know or think we know about the war. So how did decisions that were made in the archive by archivists and politicians and whomever was budgeting them and supervising them, how did they determine the body of knowledge that would then become the OR, the most influential, definitive source for this entire huge and important field of Civil War history?
Yeah. Well, it can be, I think, really tempting for people today to think of a place or an entity like the National Archives. They might think of the building. So they take it for granted that, maybe that's always been there, that when a federal government is created or a national government is created of any kind, that an archive logically goes along with it because any government is creating records. Where do those records go? They must be keeping them, right? But as you pointed out, the National Archives is less than 100 years old. That's not to say there weren't records being kept, but they weren't necessarily being archived. So can you share with our audience what existed prior to the American Civil War? How was the United States keeping and managing its records? And then how did that shift into this massive undertaking during the Civil War?
So that's a great question. The United States stands out among Western powers, from small states to, to empires, in not establishing a national archive. You would have thought, right, that in 1776, once the capital is determined in Washington, then the first thing that the new country would build, right, would be an archive. But that doesn't happen. The United States does not have a national archive or a tradition of archiving. What they have is basically for 150 years, really, is just complete chaos. So each department keeps its own records, has its own system, its own way of doing things. Records are in attics, in basements, in these improvised buildings all over Washington. There's no order, there's no mechanism. There's no system in the sense of people who are responsible for the archives of the national government. And for our purpose, it's the War Department that keeps its records. But those two are just, I mean, everywhere. Even in 1865, right after the war, then the people who are managing Confederate records are saying, look, the building is full of mice. The building is about to be flooded. I mean, this is really dangerous. And the fact that the records are in such poor shape and are so disorganized, this is one of the reasons why the federal government decides to embark on a project of transcribing, collecting, editing, and publishing these records in the huge compilation that is the official records, because it wants to make these records accessible and it wants to preserve them. I mean, the congressmen understand that at any given moment, this can all go up in smoke. And the OR
Literally, yeah.
Literally. And the OR is a way to make these records accessible. And it's also a way to really speak to veterans. I mean, the audience of the OR was professional historians, but it was veterans. And honestly, in the late 19th century, those two groups were pretty much one and the same. Most of the people who were writing Civil War history at that point were veterans who are kind of digging into their own past. You know, there's a huge debate among historians why veterans were so obsessed with the minutia of their military service, whether it was kind of a processing work of people, who didn't have therapists, who didn't have the mechanisms to deal with the long-term psychological effects of war. And then there are those who claim that it was just a way to sidestep the major political and moral questions of the war and just, deal with the details. Regardless of what was moving this, veterans were obsessed with the war, and the federal government was there to answer that obsession. It was never, professional historians didn't even exist back then. The professionalized university professor who works in the methods that we now know, the professional researcher, whether they are in a university or not, regardless of how they do research, that was not in existence. And so it was amateurs, but amateurs who were really concerned with primary sources, really wanted to know the truth, were obsessed with facts, wanted to get to nearly nail it down. And the OR is supposed to help them do that.
Well, and you mentioned veterans being one of the primary users of the OR. In order to keep a record, you have to create a record. So can we talk a little bit, you go into this in your book, about the challenges of creating the records. Some of the records weren't even being created. What are the challenges of creating these records, especially during wartime?
Right. So the United States Army is actually a very well-oiled bureaucratic machine with a lot of paperwork. I mean, military officers are used to filling out forms, writing reports, answering letters, writing letters. That's kind of part of the military culture in the United States. But then the war breaks out, and an army of 16,000 becomes two armies of 3 million total, though 3 million men were never in arms at the same time, but it becomes these huge war machines, which are also spread out across the continent. And so it's essential to communicate in writing. Communication has to be mostly not orally, but by telegraph, by report, by dispatch, by note. And so a huge amount of records gets created. However, once the record is created, it's not entirely clear what happens to it. So some officers are really meticulous and keep a really good archive of their own. But then also that archive can get lost, can get stolen, can burn up in a post-war fire in Chicago. There are really numerous tales of how records get lost. And then there are officers who don't really bother. There are officers who do a very haphazard job. Things get constantly lost within communication channels. So there's this really kind of acute tension between the fact that we have a massive amount of records from the Civil War, millions upon millions of pieces of paper documenting this event. And yet we also know that so much got lost, that about 30% of military action never even got documented in official records, and that, no officer wrote a report about this particular type of guerrilla action, about this skirmish. We know that the East is better documented than the West. We know that the Union is better documented than the Confederacy. So it's really, and this is something that kind of drove archivists in the late 19th century crazy, the people who were managing Civil War records in Washington. And it kind of drives us crazy too today, because we have so much, and yet we know that we don't really have it all, or not even close to having it all, that we don't really know, we don't have a full picture of what was happening on the ground.
I'm curious if you mentioned just how the ranks of the military itself swelled from this small, regular, professional military to this much larger one that included so many volunteers from all different walks of life. Now, plenty of professions require meticulous record keeping, but did that present its own challenge, that you were bringing so many people into the military who maybe weren't used to the expectations or bureaucracy
Right.
of the Army?
Right. So we know that 50% of officers were volunteers. And I mean, they got this very, very shallow training in military work. And, some of them just really could not be bothered, Some of them were really thinking historically and saying, I want this in the archive. And then there are those who are like, what do you want from me? I mean, I'm barely hanging on here, right? I mean, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to be a military officer. I'm not going to sit down now for 2 hours instead of going to sleep to write a report about a military action that I just took part in and that actually did not go so well. And I'd rather not have the details, really written down. So we have a lot, but some of them were really not ready and not interested in the kind of meticulous record keeping that both armies expected of their officers. And I do want to emphasize that because the Confederate Army was such a mirror image in that sense of the Union Army, the Adjutant General of the Confederate Army was the former Adjutant General of the Union Army, right? I mean, so all of that stuff is pretty consistent across both armies, with the exception that, the Confederate Army had less paper and less ink and less pens, and so things were harder in that sense. But they both were trying to keep good records, just not very successfully often.
Yeah, I appreciated that in your book you touched on some of those maybe more emotional reasons why things wouldn't exist, or external factors, but also the mundane, like, do they literally have the equipment to
some of them are really marching their soldiers with their knapsacks on their backs, and it's not a priority, and historians have to live with it. But I think that we historians always have to live with it. I mean, I think that his Civil War historians are really spoiled because we have so much. But talk to a medievalist, and they're used to having these like huge holes in their knowledge. But I think what's really misleading for Civil War historians, and I think this is where my work hopefully will help other practitioners to really rethink, is that because there is so much, we think that we have everything. And because the OR it's 128 volumes, 1,000 pages each, you are drowning when you're working in it. So it gives you the illusion that this is all. And because the collection is called The Official Records, it also somehow makes you, even if it's not consciously, but you're like, okay, this is it. It's the official record. And I'm like, no. This is a tiny sliver. This is a well-curated, carefully edited collection of records. So not only do we not have everything, but what we have published is a very small and very particular selection of records. And historians need to know that. They need to stop deluding themselves that they can know everything, and they definitely need to stop deluding themselves that the OR will give them everything they need.
Yeah, absolutely. Going back to this idea of shaping that quote unquote official record, there were some innovations, if you will, in creating records during the Civil War. Can you tell us about Major Robert N. Scott in particular, and touch on the soldier's book, Pocket Diary, as part of what you share with our audience about Scott?
Okay, so Robert N. Scott is a really important person who no one has written about, honestly. I think there's one article from 1983 that touches on his career, and that's it. Robert N. Scott was the editor of the official records for 10 years. And he was the one who made the decisions. He was the one who shaped the collection. And all of us Civil War historians are in some way beholden to his vision of what is an official record and what matters when you edit a collection. What mattered to Robert N. Scott is what we get in the OR. What didn't matter to Robert N. Scott is buried in manuscript, handwritten in the National Archives, and you need to go and try and find it. And as anyone who's ever tried to do this, it's not easy. And Scott was a really interesting character because he served the Union well, but he was actually born and raised in the South, in Louisiana and Tennessee, and moved to California as a teenager and enlisted in the regular army, but was actually arrested at the beginning of the Civil War for voicing pro-Southern sentiment in public. Then he's released and he joins the ranks. He fights. He's wounded in battle early on in 1862, and he can't go back to sort of active combat duty. And that's when he becomes a military bureaucrat. And he becomes an assistant to the Army's master bureaucrat, Henry Halleck. Kind of, he was always mocked as this clerk, but, he knew what he was doing when it came to, running this kind of machine. Not a great war hero, but a pretty effective servant of the Union cause. And that's where he learns to be a military bureaucrat. And one of his innovations, which I'm not even sure, he never left a diary. We don't have his personal records. He didn't leave. I have not seen, and no one that I know has seen his personal letters, which, people were writing at the time. That's how they were communicating with their families. But he puts out this really strange and interesting document, which is, it's a pocketbook for soldiers in which they can document their own history and also document their pay, which was pretty critical. Like, did I get paid this month? Was the paymaster actually here? Yeah, that's something that I should probably keep track of. But he's really thinking of it as a kind of, he's giving soldiers the means to document their own wartime history. And he's really elevating the service of every Civil War soldier as being worthy of documentation. And you can see that even then, even during the war period, he's really thinking historically, and he's really interested in creating documentation for the war. Then what happens is that after the war, he is desperately seeking a promotion. He's, an ambitious man, as men in the late 19th century tend to be. And he blames his inability to receive a promotion on the fact that he has Southern roots. And not only that, when he is trying to push for a promotion, then the people that he can ask some patronage from, and this is Washington in the 1870s. You don't apply for a job and then get it. You have to have this congressman push for you with that, military official, and then maybe you have a shot. And so his connections, his ties are in Tennessee. That's his network. And he doesn't really get very far until 1877, after the new administration comes in, and there's a new Secretary of War, Robert McCrary, who is much more conciliatory towards the South. This is actually the Compromise of 1877 in action. And he appoints Scott. So Scott is, again, a very logical appointment. He's legally trained. obviously historically conscious and very familiar with military bureaucracies, because this is what he did for most of the war. But suddenly in December 1877, it's no longer a problem to appoint someone with deep ties to the South for the position of compiling the official history of the war. And this really shows us just how early reconciliation starts, and what a turning point 1877 is in that sense, that it really kind of brings in new people with a new take on what the federal government should do in the South.
Mm-hmm. So we have a couple questions here about the OR, and folks sometimes come in, after we've started. So I think a few people missed what that was an abbreviation for. So I'll let the audience know that what we are talking about when we talk about the OR is the War of the Rebellion, the official records of the Union and the Confederate Armies. And that title is a mouthful. It is those 128 volumes Yael was talking about. And so we'll refer to it as the OR for the remainder of this conversation.
And the thing, if you've missed the beginning of this conversation, the thing that you really need to know is that for historians, the OR is the go-to source for Civil War history. It's 128 volumes, 1,000 pages each. It's organized temporally and geographically, so you get these very well put together series of documents about any event that you're interested in. And that's what historians use, and often use without really thinking about, like, oh my God, what's in there? Who's the editor? Who put this in front of me? And what are they not telling me? All of these questions historians have largely ignored so far, and have been using the OR fairly uncritically since it started coming out in 1880. There are not a lot of methods that have survived for that long in historical research. I mean, basically we read sources and we make sense of them. I mean, the historian's craft is in some ways it is fairly traditional, but we are critical thinkers, and we do question everything, right? Like, oh my God, do we question slave testimonies? Oh, we do, right? But the OR, we don't really question that much. And what I'm trying to do in this book is show all the ways in which particular people with particular politics, particular agendas, particular ideas about history shaped this collection for us, put it in front of us, and we have been using it ever since.
Right. Paul asks about what the OR primarily was comprised of. They're transcriptions, but is it coming mainly from primarily, he asks, handwritten documents or other formats? And I think that also, if you want to parlay that into the fact that you have to deal with transcription errors.
Right. So the OR was all originally in handwriting. I mean, some orders were printed during the war because they were important enough and received enough circulation that the War Department issued printed copies. But generally, it is reports, it is orders, it is letters, it is telegrams, notes, both brief and long, things written, notes exchanged between commanders in the heat of battle, but also kind of very detailed, very thought out after battle reports that officers were writing. It's really all in there. I mean, there's every type of record that you could more or less imagine documenting Civil War military action. And that's why it's such a rich and captivating source that's readily available online, I'll say again, and everyone here can just kind of pick their favorite period, favorite moment in the war, and just search it. I do want to say that this is not a conversation only with military historians, because it is inconceivable to imagine the history of emancipation in the South without the OR. I mean, historians of emancipation are very dependent on the OR, because a lot of the OR documents actually touch on emancipation and show emancipation in action. They talk about runaway slaves. They talk about raids. They talk about enslaved informants leading the Union Army. When you look for it, it's there, and some historians have done wonders with these documents to recreate the history of emancipation, not just with the OR armies, and this is maybe the right moment to say that there was, after the government finished editing this collection, which took a quarter of a century, starting in 1874 and ending in 1901, then it set out to do the same for the navies. So there's a companion collection that's only 30 volumes. Most of the records of the Confederate Navy were burned in Richmond in 1865, but still historians of emancipation, mainly I'm thinking Professor Thavolia Glimpf at Duke, she's done amazing things with OR navies. So these are really, really rich sources, but we are often wrong to think that these are the only sources, and they're not. They're what Robert N. Scott and his fellow compilers thought that would be interesting for us to read.
Yeah. I think you just answered this partially, but Charles asked if you could comment on the Union and Confederate naval records and if your observations about the OR apply to those, because there were multiple ones and there was one just on prisoners of war. So
yes, okay. So each series in the OR has its own story. And the naval records, the same rule basically applies. The collectors, who were white, middle and upper middle class men in the War Department, all military bureaucrats or officers, had a very fixed notion of what should be published. And they decided basically on instinct what's important, what's true. I mean, they had these very fixed categories. A record had to be contemporary, meaning written during the war. That's also more complicated than it seems, because they often let people sneak in records that were written not like in 1875. Oh, but yeah, in 1865, about a battle that took place 2 years earlier.
yeah.
Right? So they really give military officers a lot of leeway in deciding what they want to send in. And they don't really make a huge effort to make sure that records are authentic. Basically, an officer who sends in his records has to sign a written statement saying that these are faithful copies. I mean, are they faithful copies? I don't know. I mean, probably, but do we know? We don't know. But really the most there are two really important points that I want to convey. The first is that what they thought was interesting for scholars and what's important for scholars is not what we think today of as being interesting or important. For example, they really are focused only on the armies, whereas we as Civil War historians today are focused on the societies fighting these wars, on the communities, on the individuals. And so when you go into the raw records, the manuscripts, and look at what the War Department copied into the OR and didn't copy into the OR, it's it's almost a surreal experience, because so many of the records that today would make a Civil War historian, kind of jump out of their seat, Robert N. Scott and his fellow compilers just didn't think were important. And I give a few examples in the book. I'll give just one here. Sexual assault, which is a topic Civil War historians have been really troubled by for many, many years, because we have very few testimonies of sexual assault in the Civil War. And yet, could it really be that this is the only war in history in which sexual assault didn't happen? I mean, that kind of doesn't make sense. So there are all sorts of cultural explanations, and of course, the presence of Black women whose bodies were not deemed worthy report when they were assaulted. But there's also a different matter, which is these records are buried in the National Archives, and soldiers don't, and scholars don't look at them. And when you look into the raw records, sexual assault is reported. It is just, Robert N. Scott either didn't think it was important because it was about civilians, right? It's like trouble between soldiers and civilians, and he wants battlefield action, he's not particularly bothered by, what's happening to women on the home front. Or was he, there's also a debate. There was a debate in the early 20th century between scholars about whether the editors of the OR, the archivists, were hiding documents on purpose, whether there were acts of collusion between former Confederates and federal officials to hide the most embarrassing documents. I haven't seen evidence of that. But I don't know. I mean, I do know that Robert N. Scott had a phone installed in his office in 1880, which is really early. So this means that there's also this whole world of oral communication already back then in the late 19th century, which we can't retrace. Yeah, so then the other point that I want to make about the OR, which in some ways today, that seems to me this is the kind of thing that troubles me more than anything, is what the editors edit out is all the boredom. And the truth is that during a 4-year war, people are really bored and nothing happens for days and weeks. And there's just a lot of movements that don't really make sense anywhere. You know, it's not like every time an army gets up and marches, they will end up fighting some kind of heroic battle. No, often these armies are ordered to march. They go somewhere 2 miles and then they come back. There's just not, there's a lot of routine, a lot of mundane business that the editors of the OR edited out because it's boring. And I'm not saying I would work differently. Like I would not, create a written collection that no one would ever read because it's full of boredom. But I think we really need to be aware of the fact that in some ways, the OR makes the war more exciting, more dynamic, more heroic than it actually was, because it only gives us these moments of action and it doesn't show us what was actually happening on the ground, which was often, sexual assault of women while soldiers were bored.
Yeah. Bob Vance actually asked a question that you mostly just answered about if the OR was created from millions and millions of records, what types of things were left out, and are there whole areas of interest that aren't discussed and studied that are in the archive? You mentioned a few just now, and also this idea of, like, was there some kind of, collusion to hide things that, that people didn't want to have published? But this might be a good time to also pivot to, the changing uses of the archive and the materials that were going into the OR over time in the immediate wake of Abraham Lincoln's assassination, through the claims period, and then reconciliation. And as part of that, you go into detail about how former Confederate General Jubal Early and Jefferson Davis had actually a fair bit of editorial control at one point.
Sure.
On what records are being published and included.
Right.
Can you talk about all that?
So this is, I'm going to get to the collusion part. I'll answer that, but I will start from the beginning. So the collection of Confederate records begins as a way to find the smoking gun that would tie Jefferson Davis or anyone else in the Confederacy to the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. That's what they're looking for. And this is why they establish a new agency within the War Department, the Archives Office, which was supposed to be a home for Confederate records and which was searched very thoroughly by archivists, including a renowned political science professor, a German emigre, Francis Lieber, who's he's the author of the Lieber Code.
Lieber Code,
yeah, he's a big deal. He's an important person in military culture at that moment. And the job that he takes at the end of the Civil War is being the chief archivist of the Confederate records. And the reason that he takes on that role is because the assumption is that they're going to dig up all this evidence from all the records that American soldiers, that US soldiers are collecting in the South and sending to Washington, and then they're going to put people on trial. Like they really have a sense that, they're going to put together these big show trials that will end with a kind of final vindication of the Union cause. And then that doesn't happen. And the reason it doesn't happen is because they can't find anything tying the Confederacy to Lincoln, which I think now, we all know that was pretty much the case. And pretty quickly, and this is really a sign of what's going to happen later, pretty quickly the public loses interest. And there's a sense that putting Jefferson Davis on trial will end in disaster because the trial will have to take place in Richmond, and the jury will acquit him, and the government will be embarrassed and should not risk this. So then they kind of let this go. And within a few short years, the federal government begins this process of accepting claims from Southerners who claim basically to have been completely loyal to the Union and have lost property during the war on account of the Union Army's very extensive foraging and impressment and confiscation policies. And so the federal government faces 20,000 claims of Southerners, not just Southerners, also Brits, Mexicans, you name it, anyone who had anything to do with the war, also some civilians in Union border states. Basically people who said, hey, I was completely loyal, did not collaborate with the Confederacy in any way, but the Union Army still confiscated all my cotton, all my mules, all my horses, and I want $10,000. And then suddenly this archive, which seemed for a while like it was basically useless, and it didn't serve the goal of putting Jefferson Davis on trial, so now it's just going to lie there. It turns out that this archive is actually very, very useful, because for every Southerner claiming that they didn't collaborate with the Confederacy, most chances are that the archivists, if they actually search the records really well, will find some proof that this person did in fact collaborate with the Confederacy. And the Court of Claims becomes this arena in which archivists bring in evidence from the Confederate archive and really embarrass claimants, like actually, show claimants pieces of papers being like, what are you talking about? You did business with a Confederate quartermaster for 2 years. Both of your children were in the military. You expressed loyalty in this letter to the Secretary of War to our, our just cause. And so that becomes a real way of settling accounts and kind of setting the record straight. It's a moment of a lot of vitriol, a lot of you can really see the war being litigated in the Court of Claims once again. But then weirdly, that also passes. And I mean, weirdly or not weirdly, I mean, we all know that, the United States reunited eventually, right? And became one country again. And that was the whole purpose of the Civil War, was to create one nation, or to recreate it. But what happens is, as soon as Confederate records stop being fodder for the Court of Claims and become fodder for the OR, for the big editorial project, then suddenly the government is in a totally different position, because now it is not there to kind of shove it, down the throats of Confederates who are asking for money when they were in fact collaborating with the Confederacy all along, but now they actually need Confederate paperwork to complete the collection. And so suddenly Jefferson Davis is no longer this arch traitor who should have been put on trial. But suddenly he is a man with a lot of really valuable records that he has with him in Mississippi, and we need a way to get to them. And at that point, everything changes. And so Robert N. Scott starts this correspondence with Davis, and suddenly the federal government returns to Davis his trunk with his personal effects that were taken when he was caught in Georgia in May 1865. Suddenly, the government needs to be in Davis's good graces. And Davis will never forgive and will never forget. That's not what he does. But he understands that it is in his interest to work with the government in order to present a full a version as possible and a flattering version as possible of his own function as Confederate president. And he becomes one of their most important sources. And when he dies, they strike up a correspondence and then also a working relationship with his widow, Verena Davis. And it is explicitly stated that whatever Verena Davis does not want in the OR, will not go in the OR, period. She calls the shot on her private papers. Now, these papers should have been confiscated, right? I mean, they are the—
That was my next question. Yeah, I mean, is this not federal property? The federal government winds up laying out huge sums of money in some cases for these troves of papers from different people who were in the Concord Rebellion. So how does that happen? Why aren't they just confiscating them as their property?
You know what? I don't know. They never explain. I mean, I've dug out every piece of paper of these agencies that deal with Civil War records, and at no point is it explained. I mean, I don't know, maybe other people should come in and look and they'll see something that I didn't. At no point did they explain why is it that they will confiscate property. Like, they will confiscate Confederate cannons, right? They will confiscate Confederate arms. So why not Confederate paperwork? Why is that considered the private property of one Jefferson Davis? Same goes for Jubal Early. I mean, there is no greater lost cause warrior than Jubal Early, right? Unreconstructed rebel, as Gaines Foster called him many years ago in a very apt definition. And Jubal Early is simply critical. I mean, the guy lives in a room surrounded by Confederate paperwork. If you're a compiler of the OR and you want to complete the collection and you need these Confederate records in order to create a solid compilation that really offers coverage of the war on both sides, then, you're going to do business with Jubal Early. And so what I'm really able to show, I think, is the ways in which the archive is both shaped by this new reconciliatory spirit that's so prevalent in the US, starting in the mid-70s, but also that it's actually that these compilers were pushing reconciliation forward willingly, that by going to Davis, by going to Early as federal bureaucrats, they were the people who fought in the war. They were all officers or devoted War Department bureaucrats, and saying, please, can we come to you and copy those records which you will let us? That's a new relationship between those who had rebelled against the federal government and those who were crushing the rebellion.
Yeah. So we have a lot of questions flooding in here, and you've gotten to a fair number of these, but so Greg asks about what influenced military functions for which archiving could play a significant role, such as military justice, have on record keeping, where they're notable. He asks about court-martials in which the documented history had a major effect on the decisions. But when I'm thinking about your book, I'm thinking about war crimes and I'm thinking of Andersonville. Can you comment on how the archives and the OR played into cases like that kind of military justice?
Right. So, you asked about the Prisoners of War series. That's series 2. And there was a huge disagreement in the War Department about how extensive series 2 should be. The person who was in charge of compiling it was actually a former prisoner, and he wanted as many records in there as possible. And then his supervisors in the War Department, and particularly one kind of very difficult guy, Fred C. Ainsworth, who was this bureaucratic genius, but very, very tough and kind of unpleasant, hard-driving boss. He thought it didn't matter, that it wasn't important, that it should be a leaner series, that he doesn't want stories, he doesn't want a lot of background and context, he just wants the facts. So in some ways, there are elements of the prisoner of war experience which are really well documented because every exchange of prisoners required a lot of paperwork. But yeah, on Andersonville, there's not that much. Whatever the federal government had, it put in the OR, but it's not that much. And most of what we know about Andersonville, at least according to my understanding, is from the stories that soldiers then told, but it's not official.
Yeah. Ruth Yance wants to know if there's an index or table of contents in the OR, and that is an entire story unto itself, Ruth. But Yael, can you comment on that?
Okay, so the index of the OR is this whole really crazy story. It's massive. It's 2 volumes. It took years to compile. And why is that? because the compilers of the OR were thinking about veterans, and they wanted every single veteran who's mentioned in the compilation to be able to find his own records through the index. However, what they didn't think about are themes, right? So there are anything that you would today imagine is indexable, right? Topics, major battles, major theaters of war. None of that is there. The index is very driven by naming and by allowing veterans the ability to easily locate their own names, their personal names, and the names of their units. And it takes years to put together. It's a tremendous amount of work. But scholars have basically found it completely useless, because when you're a scholar and you want to read about a particular battle, then you need the index to tell you where those records are. You can't go to the index and look for every particular officer. Where is their report on that battle? And then go back to the volume. So the OR gave people a lot of headaches before keyword searching arrived. And once keyword searching arrived, it really revealed the full potential of this collection to really kind of open up what the Civil War as a lived experience, because then you can suddenly find everything.
Speaking of being able to find everything, Paul Dinkel wants to know what website leads to the OR. It's on the National Archives website, correct?
Yes. But Cornell has a really good website called Making of America.
Oh, yep.
And it's accessible there. It's PDF. It's very easily readable. It's really, it's really an experience. So I encourage everyone to kind of delve into it. But when you're delving into it, also keep in mind that there are entire backstories to what it is that you're reading that the OR doesn't tell you, right? It deludes you into thinking that these are just the facts. And they're not just the facts. It's a very carefully selected set of facts. And that is also it's also really influenced by participants. I mean, the fact that the War Department was so dependent on the goodwill of former officers to submit their records made a huge difference, because people really sent in what they wanted and didn't send in what they didn't want. The federal government, if it didn't confiscate Jubal Early's papers, it sure as hell was not going to confiscate the records of its own officers, right?
Right.
So, this guy sends you things, you're in the War Department, and that's it. This is what you have to work with. Whether they're copies, whether they're originals, whether it's the whole collection, whether it's some of it. And every once in a while, and it does come across in the correspondence of these compilers with officers. Every once in a while, they realize that someone is bluffing, that someone has changed names and dates and wording. And so they know that officers are not being completely honest with their records, but largely, this is what they have.
Yeah. So a couple of comments here. Wesley Brown notes that he's read some diaries and first-person accounts of participants, excellent sources of primary historical material. Thank you for that, Wesley. That's true. We can find that supplementary material in other places. Ronald Howe asks, in general, are the Confederate records in the OR as extensive, as detailed in comparison to the Union archive available today? You've answered that a little bit, that it's not, because of various circumstances.
Right. Yeah. Because the Confederacy was poorer and still less organized, and had less resources, and a lot burnt in 1865. Burned and scattered. And I mean, there are just incredible descriptions of people just, offloading records when they're running away from the Union Army, and they just need to go faster, and they just can't keep going with these crates of old papers, and they just toss them aside. And that's another loss that we have to live with. And absolutely. I mean, in my own work, I've relied very extensively on not so much for this book, but for my first book on diaries, on letters. We have enormous documentation. This book really is about the official documentation and how we take it for granted and how we really shouldn't, and who are the people behind what we call official.
Yeah. Charles Mitchell wants to know if materials from non-military figures such as governors, members of Congress in the OR, how did they get their accounts in the OR, if so, and you know, how much of it's non-military folks? And my understanding is unless they also served in the military,
No, so
or issuing orders. Yeah.
right. So the OR also has two series, which I touch on pretty lightly, which are concerned with the relationship between government, state governments, and the Army. So series 3 and 4 respectively cover the Union and the Confederacy. They're slimmer, they're less detailed, especially for the Confederacy, again, for the reasons we all understand. But they do exist. They are not, you will not find them in series 1, which is about active operations. You will find them in series 3 and 4. Again, to the extent that someone thought they were important and interesting enough. And that's, once again, a matter of judgment. And our judgment is not the judgment of men in the late 19th century.
So we have a couple questions. I'm going to try to get to a few more here, even though we're at time. That
Oh, no worries.
Emily Berman is asking about like what percentage, and this is going to be hard to quantify, but what percentage of records at the National Archives about the Civil War are not covered by the OR?
I mean, I would say the great majority. Like I can't speak in percentages because I've only looked at samples of raw records. But in the raw records, let's say if it's 4 documents per page, then 1 document will be copied per page, or 1 per 2 pages. I mean, I think it's not consistent. I think some, you know, when it's the sort of hardcore correspondence about a particular battle, then everything will go in. But then there are entire categories of records that are very scarcely represented in the OR.
Yeah. Robert Olish has a question about your interest in other periods of time, US or other countries besides the Civil War in the US. And this sort of also connects loosely to a question from Bob earlier about just his curiosity about the popularity of studying the American Civil War in Israel. And that also connects to something Melvin Cunningham asked earlier in the program that we didn't get to about the relationship between Abraham Lincoln and the Jewish people and American Jewish people, which is documented. So,
right. Well, thank you. These are all great questions. You know, I mean, obviously, I'm very interested in the history of Europe and the Middle East in the 20th century, you know, both biographically, but also because these are really kind of, you know, world transforming moments and times. So I always think about the Civil War comparatively, especially to World War I, which I think is an important comparison. It's impossible not to think about the Civil War as part of this world of 19th century warfare, whether it's the Crimean War or the German wars of reunification or the Franco-German War of the 1870s. I mean, it is a really interesting time in which I've always felt that you could kind of see modernity being born. But you also see how gradual and complex that process is, and how people are such creatures of habit in the mid to late 19th century. And I think that's really, you know, these are important lessons to learn as we are also living in a moment of tremendous change and uncertainty. And the Civil War was such a moment in which a system that stood firm for 250 years was breaking down, and the very notion of a republic was the very existence of the idea of a republic was in question. So I think, you know, it really that really speaks to me as someone who's interested in historical change. Clearly, I'm very interested in the history of Israel, of Zionism, of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, very, very committed to a just and lasting solution of this conflict, despite everything that we've been through, both peoples. I mean, for Israelis, the Civil War, they think about it in two ways. They think about the questions I get are, is a civil war going to start in America now? And is a civil war going to start in Israel now? And I mean, I have to admit that the especially in 2023, when things were really tense within Israel during the pro-democracy movement and the efforts of this government to basically pass a regime change, I really felt like we may be at a kind of a moment that I really felt like I was living in the late 1850s. That this is just about to break down, and Israelis are going to just start firing at each other on the streets, and we'll have militias fighting each other over this. I mean, it really, there were moments when I was on the streets during that time when it smelled like a civil war was about to start. And that, that was very, and then something else happened, and, the dynamic shifted completely. But it's been really helpful for me to think so deeply and to kind of devote my life to studying this moment of monumental change, as as I personally live in a place that's somehow permanently war-stricken, and as we really enter a kind of a time of tremendous fluctuations, I think all over the world, especially in the US for sure right now, but just all over the world really, with technology, with climate change, with all these great forces that are going to shape the rest of our lives. Then I think actually thinking about the Civil War is really helpful.
One last sort of audience member question, comment, and then I'll end with a question I have for you. John Murphy noted how much he's enjoying the presentation, and wants to make the point that he spent 48 years total time, 20 active duty, 28 as a civil service employee as part of the U.S. Air Force, nearly 40 of those years as an Air Force historian. And he said, sadly, I have to admit that the more things change, the more they remain the same. Even today, historians are limited by what information they are able to get from leadership. And he gives some examples and was curious about your view of military archives today. And then I have a final question for you, and then we'll close out for the evening.
Look, I mean, I think, I think we know very little about what goes on in the military. I can say that the Israeli military archives, which I take my students to in a class on knowledge and power in the archive, which is totally transnational, I think 3% of that archive is open to the public. So we really don't know anything. I mean, and we really, I mean, the army will give us nothing, and the rest we will need to learn from civilians. And okay, we have, as soon as we enter the 20th century, but also for the Civil War, we have so much information coming in from civilians, and that kind of has to make up for what the military will tell us. I was just listening to the news from Israel, and the Israeli army is now coming out with its reports on the events of October 7th. And that's really interesting to see these, these basically written bodies of knowledge trying to understand what happened that day and how was the military so dysfunctional at the moment when it really should have been there. And so I think these questions of fact, truth, of the way that officials interact with the public, what do they owe us? What do we ask of them? What will they give us? What will we demand? These are really pertinent questions.
For the end of your book, Yael, you include a series of unanswered questions. Of those, which seems most consequential to you as you consider the effect the OR has had on public understanding of the Civil War and its legacies?
I think what has sort of driven me really crazy all these years of working on this project is that I don't know why the federal government in 1874, which is really early, decided to publish Confederate records along with Union records and essentially created this monument to reconciliation, because they were the winners in the war. And I don't think it's that typical for winners in the war to publish the history of the losers in the war. And what I have is an order by the Secretary of War, William Belknap, before he embarks on this grand tour of the American West. He tells his personal secretary to order that the records of the Union and the Confederate armies will be published pari passu, will be published side by side. And that determines the nature of the OR more than anything, because it elevates the Confederate side of the war and gives it an equal footing to the Unions. And what was Belknap thinking politically? Was he thinking historically? Was he thinking archivally? Who was pushing him? Like, what was going on behind the scenes there? That has really troubled me. And the archive doesn't offer an answer. Again, maybe something will pop up, you know, maybe this is for a different historian, but I have not been able to find out.
Fascinating. Thank you so much for the conversation this evening, Yael.
Thank
It was
you, Erin.
great
This
to
was
have you with us.
wonderful questions. I really enjoyed it. True pleasure.
Phyllis, back to you.
All right. Yes, so many comments in the background chat stating how much everyone has enjoyed tonight's program. So thank you. It's been wonderful to hear about your book, and I know everyone with us tonight has really enjoyed it. Next up, please join us on Thursday, April 3rd for a presentation and discussion with author and photographer David B. Weigers on women's sculptures as featured in his article, Wildfire, Miss Clampett, and the Wonder Girl from the West, Early Women's Sculptures of Abraham Lincoln, published in the Lincoln Forum Bulletin, Spring 2024 edition. And to close out our spring 2025 Foursquare programming, we will have Dr. Frank Garman with us on Tuesday, May 13th to discuss his latest book, A Wonderful Career in Crime, Charles Callum's Masquerades in the Civil War Era and Gilded Age. For more information on these programs, visit our website at lincolnpresidential.org and register soon. Finally, as you close out tonight's program, we hope that you will take a short survey, and this helps us determine what we want to do in the next round. As always, we thank you for joining us this evening, and we look forward to seeing you all in April. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Night.